I actually found I can get a slightly longer chop if I bring the sample size down, eyes 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 down, ey
Hello, and excited to introduce you today to one of my favorite modules of all time, the 2hp Freez. Small little module here, but packs a whole lot of power in just 2 HP. Let me walk you through what it does. First, you've got an input. This is where you put a sound source or some sort of audio thing that you want to freeze. Next, you've got a size control. You're going to hear me demo this, but this is going to change the size of your freeze. So over on the left will be extremely short, almost audio rate modulation grains. And all the way to the right, you're going to be kind of hearing this slow stuttering effect with the freeze, where it's really probably gets up to probably about less than a second. So not a super long delay, but can get you a pretty good sized freeze delay in there as well. You can control that with CV through this here, or you can just twist this knob. Next down here, this little green light is going to show you the basically if the freeze is on or not. And this button is going to let you manually trigger that on and off. Now this switch is going to take it from latch mode to momentary mode, which is what I actually prefer to use. And momentary mode, basically when the button is pushed, then the freeze is on. Now you can also trigger that with a CV. So if I take a CV here and I just run that from my BeatStep Pro, I can turn that on by triggering that from another source as well with CV. So most of the time I'm triggering this not with the button, but with something else here. Next down here we have the sample rate. And this, again, you can control with CV, and you can also twist this knob here. So at all the way to the right, you're going to have full kind of regular audio sample rate. As you bring it down, you get this kind of reduced sample rate bit crusher effect, which also starts to mess with how frequently you freeze. And so that's what's really interesting about the module, is the way that these two things interact makes for some really cool stuff. And if you go all the way to the left, you're at a pretty heavily bit crushed, low sample rate audio, but a lot of fun stuff you can do with that in terms of just almost like fading it out and then fading it back in. Like it's really a really cool effect. And then last, you have your simple audio output. And that's it. That is the module. It's really simple, really straightforward, but what I think is powerful is just hearing all the use cases. Before I dive on, you're probably sitting here saying, hey, this thing's sitting right next to a data bender. I already got a data bender. Doesn't it have a freeze on it? It does, but I find that the data bender and the 2hp Freez are very different effects. But what I find with the data bender is rarely am I using it just as a freeze module. Normally I'm adding bend or break or corrupt and adding these other things and kind of mixing that in. So I find I get completely different sounds from the data bender than I do from the freeze. If I literally turned everything off on the data bender, I could probably get something similar to what the 2hp Freez does, but probably not really, because it doesn't have the exact same sample rate kind of mess up thing going on here. So I could probably get the size here. I could probably emulate the top half on the data bender, but I don't think I could really emulate what the bottom half does, which is where I think it gets really cool. And so basically, summary is that the data bender, in my mind, is a completely different audible effect than the 2hp Freez. Love them both. 2hp Freez is obviously a fraction of the price of the data bender, and love this thing. I've had it. It's one of my first modules I got, and I will never get rid of it. It is awesome. All right, let's dive into some demos. All right, so in this patch, what I'm going to be doing is taking the actual output of my Manus Iteritas, which is running through this Versio unit that has a Lacrima Versio on it, which is then going through WMD Carbon, which basically just makes a cool sound, which I just like the tone of it all. But I'm going to be running that into the Freez, and so I'm going to put that output into here, which I just have running through a mixer for some control later. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take the output of my BeatStep Pro and put it into the trigger, and that's going to let me just turn it on and off right there. So I'm going to actually zoom out real quick so you can see. And so just for context, so again, you can just see here, light turns on when I push it. So again, just really cool way. It just lets me kind of trigger it on and off and freeze it. And finally, I'm going to take my output and plug it into my mix. So at the moment, I'm not going to do any CV over the size or the sample rate because I think it's actually a little better. So what I'm going to do is just kind of play this. You're just going to hear kind of a repeating eighths note kind of rhythm going on. And I'm just going to twist the sample rate and size and let you kind of hear the demos of what those two features do. I'll first do them kind of independently, and then I'll just start to kind of mess around with them and give you a taste for what those things can do. As you can see, this thing's pretty insane. You know, the size, you know, it's gonna let you get up to that, like, squealing audio rate modulation, and the sample rate gets down all the way into that just absolute, like, bit crush territory, but then you can kind of freeze it. And I just find there's some really cool things with freezing and then wobbling the sample rate. Really wobbling either of them while it's frozen makes some pretty cool sounds. Now, what I think is interesting about this versus like a 2HP slice is that it's not clockable. And so I've had times where I've used it in a patch where I honestly tried to make it work like the slice, which is clockable. And what I would do is I kind of just get my knobs dialed in until it kind of like froze right in time with my song, which is cool. But I feel like it's not really the potential of it. Now that you have the 2HP slice, it's really a lot easier to just, you know, it's all clockable. So you're just going to go through divisions of your song. So with this, I feel like this is much more of a sound design effect module. You can get these crazy dubstep things out of it. So yeah, like that's kind of what we're doing. I'm going to play around with a few more patches and just show you what we can do with the various parameters there. All right, so in this video, I'm going to do a similar thing where I'm going to play around with the size and the sample rate here. I'm actually going to have a sequence running from my WMD Trash Master. Basically, really, I just run in the Trash Master, and then the only other thing that I've got going on is actually have a foot pedal off screen here, which I'm using through a Pulp Logic Express, which I recently did in another video. That's letting me control the filter of the TRSHMSTR, so that's kind of giving you the cool raw sound. I'll play that for a bar or two, and then we'll start messing with the freeze on it. All right, so I got another pretty cool patch here. This time what I actually have is an envelope that's going to run at the start of every bar from my PAMs. And that's going to modulate the size. So you're going to hear the size go from big to really tiny, and it's going to create this kind of like ramp up effect. So just showing again what you can do with some modulation and some cool sound design, and then I'm going to twist and play with the sample rate a little bit with that as well. So as you can see here, a lot of really cool sounds out of this. A few things I'll hit on and say about the freeze, which is interesting about any freeze module, but I actually like manually triggering them as instead of programming. You can get some cool sounds that are very predictable when you program them in. I did that a little bit during my first jam where I just kind of turned on a few sequences. But one of the cool things about the freeze is like, if you do it by hand, then you're just going to be microscopically different every time and have a different sound to the freeze. And I find that really cool. Occasionally you may miss slightly and then you get a weird sound kind of for a freeze for a bar, but you know, that's kind of the nature of glitch effects, is sometimes they glitch and don't work perfectly. But that's human error because you grabbed the wrong spot and you like glitched on like the silent part of the note or something. So anyway, love that aspect of it as well. All right, next patch I'm going to show you is actually going to be running just the output of a drum sequence into the 2hp Freez, and we're just going to freeze and glitch on some drums and show you what that sounds like.
In this section, you'll notice my voice sounds a little different, and that's because I'm talking through this. It's an old vintage Kai microphone, which I've got running through my Swastopole, and that is basically going straight into the 2hp Freez. And so we're going to mess around with it and see what we can do with some hold on, let me turn that down a little here. Some vocal. So, pretty cool stuff here. One thing I should note is I did switch this over to latch mode, so that way I can just click my little button here one time and it'll latch on. Again, that's momentary. Pressing it, turning it on and off. Latch, I just hit it on, and then I hit it again when I want it off. So we'll just grab some more vocal chop. And I find I like to grab a large sample at the start and then mess with it. So let's get some vocal chop. I actually found I can get a slightly longer chop if I bring the sample size down, eyes 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 down, ey So, one thing I will say about the freeze is, like, you heard that there, and that's like you get a pretty darn cool thing going. But the challenge is that it's not clockable. And so that is a big differentiator between the slice and the freeze. So the slice, basically, you get the top half, you get this freeze section, and you get clock input. And the ability to divide your clock input. So instead of your size just being kind of arbitrarily loose, you are actually taking a clock input, and so you're dividing it. So you're dividing it by like 1 bar, half a bar, quarter notes, eighth notes, 16th notes, etc. So your freezes are rhythmically in time. But on the slice, you don't get the bit crusher. So what I would say is the slice is better as a rhythmic tool, and the freeze is a lot better as a sound design tool. But if you really get into these weird loops, you're just going to struggle. Like, you can maybe fine-tune and get that in there, but it's really hard to do on the fly to really just get that on point. So, yeah. So I'll give you an example here. Let me just add a quick beat. And now I'm going to try to get a good time sample going with this sweet track. Let me get that down. Get that down, yeah. Make a sweet track, yeah. Make a sweet track, 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 sweet track. So you can kind of see what I mean there. It's like you can't really get a freeze rhythmically in time. It's just not what it's meant to do. So it's meant to do just really cool, crazy friggin' effects and just like yeah, making a sweet. Let's do it one more time. Let's grab a sweet thing. Let's make a little thing go bling, 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 bling. Alright, so that's me sliding, making something rhythmically with my voice. A little challenging, but as again, you can see a whole lot of fun, a whole lot of things you can do with this. Probably wouldn't throw this on vocals too much, but it gives you some taste for what it's doing.
So as you can see, that is the 2hp Freez. A lot of power in a very small HP. Love this thing. One of my favorite modules. Highly recommend picking one up. Head over to perfectcircuit.com. Grab yourself a 2hp Freez. Those guys are awesome, and really can't recommend this module enough. One of my favorites. If you love freeze effects, get yourself a 2hp Freez, and you're going to have a lot of fun with it.